Welcome to my step-by-step transparent watercolor demonstration for my painting Homestead. The photograph on the right is the reference for this painting, and you can see that I opted to go with more of a vignetted composition and take some of the elements out that I didn't want in my painting. I've sketched my drawing directly onto my watercolor paper with a 2B pencil, and I've drawn the major shapes and some of the architectural features of the structure. I'm going to begin my painting by applying a background wash. This is a mixture containing yellow ochre, pyrrole red, and a little cerulean blue. And as I work through this wash, there's times I want it a little cooler. I'm going to add a little bit more cerulean blue. I'm applying this wash with a silver black velvet jumbo round small, which is a nice wash brush. And I'm not using any masking fluid with this painting. There's some elements that I could mask if I wanted, but I'm just going to use direct painting. And right now I'm painting wet on dry as I apply this wash around the edges of this structure. When I paint, I normally paint at a 15 to 20 degree angle, and I use gravity to my advantage. And as I apply this wash, the wash stays in place. I have control over it because it's only going where I apply it or where the paper is wet. It'll follow the path of least resistance, and the dry paper provides enough resistance to prevent that wash that I'm applying from running down the page, even though my board is at a 20 degree angle. I think this is a concept that people who are beginning with watercolor struggle with at first. They're afraid to put their board at an angle because they think the paint is just going to run all over the place. But once you learn to control the beat of water and let gravity work towards your advantage, it'll make a very big difference in how you approach your paintings. Now, when I start to get a little too much water build up, I take my damp brush and touch it to the paper, and it'll pick up that bead of water that's in an area that you don't want it. Because even though it isn't running down the page, if you leave too big a bead of water for too long, eventually it can backwash and into the areas that are drying and might give you an undesirable effect. On the right side of this, I've added a little bit of sap green to my mixture, and it's primarily a mixture where I'm painting right now of pyrrole red and sap green. When I start a painting, I normally start with the larger shapes and then work towards the smaller shapes, and I start with the lighter values and work towards darker values. I've inserted the reference photo in the top right corner there, and right now I am coming in, I'm giving the suggestion of this pine tree that's in the foreground, and it's going to remain in the foreground of my composition. And it's not my intention to try and paint the individual branches, but I'm going to give this representation and suggestion of this pine tree by treating it like it's one large shape. As I paint this tree, this pine, I'm working with mixtures of sap green, pyrrole red, and royal blue. And in some instances I've worked in some cerulean, but most of the time I'm working with those three colors: pyrrole red, sap green, and royal blue. And royal blue is also known as indanthrone or indanthrine or death blue. But the darker value I get when I mix in the royal blue. And one of the things I have to be careful of is there's a tendency for it to get a little blue-green, and I counter that by putting in some more pyrrole red, which warms it up a little bit and makes it more of the color that I'm after. I have a darker mixture here. It's still fairly warm, and it's more of a brownish tone, and it's a mixture of royal blue, alizarin crimson with some yellow ochre in it. And I'm giving the suggestion of that tree trunk shape as part of this larger shape and putting some of this darker tone. And I'm letting this wash run over the edge of that house, and I'm not going to be using detailed branches or brushwork to overlap this house. I'm letting this wash do some of the overlap and let that part of the house just kind of fade into the wash. I've taken the fine mist spray here just to soften some of the bottom edges of this tree shape. When you do get some paint in an unwanted area, there's still normally time where you can just blot it up and you don't have to panic and fear that you've gotten it over something that you don't want. Now I'm going to start to paint, again, a larger shape, but I'm going to paint the shadow side of the structure. And right now I'm using a 1/2 inch flat brush. This painting that I'm doing is being done on a 1/4 sheet of watercolor paper. So it's 11 inches by 15 inches. The colors that I'm using here are a mixture of cerulean blue and a color called Halloween orange. As I paint this shape, I'm working with mixtures in which I've varied the ratios of these two colors. So I have a mixture that has a larger percentage of cerulean blue, and I have a mixture that's got a larger percentage of Halloween orange. So one leans towards the warm and one leans towards the cool side. Even though I know that the windows on the side of this are going to be in shadow also, I've decided that I'm going to paint around them for now, knowing that eventually I'm going to put some washes over top. But I want to do a little bit of work with the window panes before I glaze over them with a shadow wash. I'm going to use the same color mixture, and I'm going to paint the shadow side of this part of the building structure that's a little farther away, but it's still the shadowed side of this structure. And I'm continuing to work right now with a 1/2 inch flat brush. And just as I did on the other side, I'm going to leave the window alone for now. I'm going to take some of this wash. Now I'm going to go underneath the covering of the porch, because that's going to be in shadowed, not just on the side there, but also on the front of the other building. It's going to have part of a half shadow on it. So I'm going to try and define that with this wash. And you can see I'm still using a combination of warm and cool tones. So far, most of what I've done has been in a middle to light middle value. Nothing really dark yet. The tree is the darkest shape that I have. And you can see there where I've indicated the kind of half shadow that's hitting the front side of that house, and the shadows being created by the covering on the porch. I'm going to build another layer on this tree and just try and create the feeling of these elements of the tree hanging down. And again, I'm going to let this break the edge of that house because this is in the foreground and it's overlapping the shape of the structure. I've decided I want this area that's in shadow to be a little darker than what I have it. In fact, I'll probably build these shadows a number of times as I move through my painting process and develop this painting. I'm going to continue that darker value on the underside of the porch structure. I'm going to do some more with that same value on this this other side in shadow, the closest plane of the structure. Still working with the same mixture of cerulean blue and Halloween orange. I'm going to work this value underneath the edge of the roof, and I'm going to gradate it down the edge of the building a little bit. I'm actually working with a fairly small brush to do this. I could be using my 1/2 inch, or could use bigger a brush if I wanted, but right now I'm using a rather small, kind of a general purpose sable brush. I'm going to come in here with clear water and soften the edge. And I'm going to soften it even more by using the fine mist spray. I'm going to start to put some darker values in these window shapes. And I'm going to break these rectangular shapes up with a wash. I'm not going to just make a dark square. I'm going to try and give the indication that there's some light reflecting off of these, or there's some curtains in the windows. And I'm using a mixture of royal blue with a little bit of Halloween orange in it. So the royal blue is a dark value, and the Halloween orange just takes it off the blue side a little bit and moves it more towards neutral, but it's still a dark blue tone that I'm using. Here I'm doing similar brushwork in this window, and you can see how I've left some light spots within these dark shapes, just to give the indication of some reflective light. And in the left window, I've given the indication of a shade hanging down. I've put the reference photo in the top left corner again, so I can briefly talk about what I have in a number of my videos, the difference between copying a photograph and giving your interpretation. If you look at the window that I'm working on right now, if you look at that in the reference photo, the bottom half of that has a blue and white sign. It may be hard to see in the video, but it has a blue and white sign, and I don't want that blue and white sign in my painting. So I'm going to edit it out. It's my interpretation of the scene, and I don't want that in it. Just as I've decided I didn't want the street, I didn't want the road sign, and I didn't want the mailboxes. That's not what I want in my representation of this scene. That's not how I want to present it in my piece of art. There can often be a tendency to not want to do that and just paint what's in the photograph. And many people would take this photograph, if they were painting it, and they would paint the blue and white sign, and they would paint the street, and they'd paint every mailbox and street sign. But there's a difference between just copying photographs and giving your interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with putting in the mailbox or the street signs if that's how you want to present it. But you just have to be aware that those are decisions you have to make. I've treated all these windows and door shapes in a similar manner here with a very similar tone, although in some areas I've warmed it up a little bit more than others. I'm going to take the 1/2 inch flat brush and just touch it to the paper to give the pattern that appears in this railing. It gives the look of the spindles. And I'm giving just a touch on the underside of the rail with a darker value. And continue that pattern of the railing. Go on the length of the porch. As I go, I try to angle the brush a little bit so that I break up some of the marks so they don't all look the same. Here I'm going to work some darker value shapes into the shapes that I've already placed down for the windows and the doors. And this is a cooler tone than what I have in some of these areas. So it's royal blue with Halloween orange, but it has a little bit more of the royal blue in it. Here I'm putting some of the darker marks in these other windows. And you can see I try to use different parts of the brush. I put it at different angles. I'll use the corner, I'll use the side, I'll lay it flat and drag it. You can really get a lot more out of a brush such as a flat brush than people often do. Sometimes people feel all you can do with a flat brush is put it down and drag it and leave a mark the width of the brush, but you can do quite a bit with it by varying the angle that you use the brush. I'm going to work a darker valued wash similar to what I used to the left. And I'm putting it here on the shadowed area of this house that's underneath the gutter that casts a shadow down on the front side of that house that's otherwise sunlit. Here I'm going to complete this area, but I'm going to take that same tone and I'm going to get it a little bit darker to the left here and get the underside of this gutter. And then I want to take it, continue that on to the other shadowed side of this building. I'm just trying to make it darker underneath the edge of the roof line. Here I'm going to put just a little bit of a darker value around the edge of the window frame. Not too dark. I'm going to soften it up just to give a slight indication of the edge and shadow that's there. Not too much, but just enough to make an edge there that gives a distinction between the frame of the window and then the side of the house. I'm going to do the same thing here. Just putting a darker value on that edge, then I'm softening it up. A little bit of a dark valued cooler tone here. I'm getting the underside of the roof. And I'm going to take this cool tone and I'm going to take it underneath the porch area of the house and darken that up a little bit. So I'm going to take this mixture, which is royal blue with some Halloween orange in it, and I'm going to bring it down to that area, that line that represents the break in the shadow on the front side of that. But it's a cooler tone than what I had in there, and it's a little darker value. And I'm going to carry that all the way down to the porch. I'm taking this tone all the way across and then down to the railing. So that makes that area look a little cooler and a little bit more in shade. I'll take that same value in a couple other areas here underneath the railing. That would still be that same wall of the structure. And I'm going to put some of that cooler tone also underneath the porch. I'm going to take that all the way across. And I'm going to take some water and I'm going to soften the edges of those shapes. And again, I'm leaving this more of a vignette composition. So it just, the bottom of that house, the shapes I have just start to gradate out to the white of the paper. I want to darken the value behind the house and put some branches in. I want to keep a clean edge, so I'm just going to put some clear tape along the edge of the structure while I put in the wash and take a liner brush and make some marks that look like branches. I'm coming in with a middle value wash. That's a mixture of sap green, a little pyro red, a little yellow ochre. And I'm just giving the indication of a middle value shape that represents the mass that you kind of get when you have a bunch of branches. They almost take on a shape as a unit, even though there's not a lot of leaves on the branches in this, my reference photo. It's just not that time of year. But I'm putting this middle value wash, and the plastic tape I put down is keeping a clean edge for my painting. And I'm drying this, and now I'm going to come back in. I'm going to start to give the indication of some trees and some branches back here. I'm using some of the similar tones that I've been using elsewhere in the painting. I've got a little cerulean blue mixed in with a combination of Halloween orange, and I put in some yellow ochre. I'm working a little green, and it just repeats some of the colors that I've used in other places in my composition. Here I'm coming in with just a little darker value and just making some marks on a few of these branches. It's nice to keep some irregularity in the brush marks that you make so they're not just a bunch of continuous straight lines. So I've broken it up with value, and I've made breaks in my lines. And here I touch it with a Kleenex, which creates a little bit of textural quality. And I carry this one off the page. Here I'm going to hit it with a spray bottle, and it'll soften some of the edges, it'll run some of the colors together, and just bring more sense of unity to that shape back there. Now I'll remove this tape. This is just clear packing tape, the same kind you use to ship a package with. And it's giving me a nice clean edge. I want to do the same thing on the right side of this building, so I'm going to repeat this process. I'm going to put a piece of tape down on the right side of this structure. And now here I'm coming in with a wash that's again middle value, but it has a little bit more sap green into it. And I'm going to paint around the top edge of this and carry it up a little bit. And at the bottom of this, I've left a bit of a horizontal line which helps ground this composition and make it feel more like a natural landscape. If you don't have a strong horizontal somewhere in your composition, it'll tend to float and feel unbalanced. Again, I'm going to give a suggestion of some saplings and some branches back here. And once again, I'll remove my tape and I have a clean edge. I want to darken this tree shape here that's in the foreground and give a little bit more definition, even though I'm keeping it for the most part one shape. I want it to be a little darker valued. Keep in mind when you apply a wash and it dries, it's going to dry much lighter than when you apply it. I want this to look a little bit more like the branches hanging down of a pine tree. So I'm taking this darker value and trying to give that suggestion with my brush strokes. And I'm going to bring in a fine mist spray and soften that up a little bit and diffuse some of that color on top of the lighter shape that I had underneath this wash. Anytime I get the drips of paint, I'll just blot it with a tissue or pick it up with my brush. And sometimes I'll leave part of it because I like the effect that I get. I want to take a little finer point brush here with that dark value and give just a little crisper definition to parts of this shape. I'm going to put the indication of a couple saplings just behind this pine tree with a shadow, and these are not necessarily in the photograph, but I want to create a little bit more of a horizontal plane on this side of the house. So I've made some marks here to give the indication of a few saplings, and I'm going to take a shadow wash and bring that across. It helps create some overlap, brings a little bit more dimension to that side of the composition, and again introduces a stronger horizontal plane. And I bring those right up to the edge of the building, and even though I haven't painted on the building at all in that area, it's the white of the paper, by bringing that darker shape and negative space to the edge, it helps reinforce the fact that that is the shape of the house, the edge of the shape. It reinforces that edge. I want to go still darker on this side here. So I've got a mixture of sap green, pyrrole red with a little royal blue, and then I'm going to come in with some yellow ochre and strengthen the shape that's on that side. It's a soft edge shape, but strengthen that area with a darker value. I thought about leaving the top of the roof there with the white of the paper, but I've decided to come in with a middle value blue-gray tone and give it more the color of the roof in my reference. As I paint this, I'm using a combination of a cooler wash and warmer wash, and this still is a mixture of royal blue with some Halloween orange in it. I'm using my 1/2-inch flat brush to do this, and you can see that I change the direction that I make the mark with. When I need a thin mark, I take it in one direction, and when I want a full brush stroke, I'll go perpendicular to that motion and make a full brush stroke. And here I'm just touching it with a tissue, and it just brings a textural quality to it that gives some more interest than just that plain flat wash. And I've decided I want to come in and go darker here on this side. I've done this a couple times, but it's dried much lighter than what I really wanted it. And in this application now, I'm going to start to come over top of some of these window shapes that I have. And I'm not going to just completely cover them. I'm going to leave some breaks in the wash. This is still royal blue with some Halloween orange. As you can see on that top left window how I brought a wash over part of the window and left some of it without the wash. And you can see that I'm still leaving the suggestion of some reflections and some glare in the glass of the windows. As I come down towards the end of this, I make different brush strokes. I'll shorten up a brush stroke. I'll make a break, and I just try and let it vignette off into the white of the paper. I want to put a little bit more detail with some much darker value pigment here in these windows. So I'm taking a sharper point brush. This is a quill brush that I like to use, and I've got a mixture that has a lot of royal blue in it. Still a touch of Halloween orange, so it's not as blue, but it's a cool mixture. And I'm just strengthening the shape here in the window and the reflections. You can see I'm not just painting squares. I just make a variety of brush marks, some longer than others, some short, some wide, but to help reinforce that feeling that there's some reflection of the glass. I have the nearest side done, and I'm going to do the same brushwork in these other windows. So I'm coming in with the same dark value. Here I'm going to take that same value and I'm going to do some brush work along some of the edges to bring out some of the architectural features and define some of the shapes of this building. And it'll also, I'll use some of these brush marks to define edges or where shapes are coming together. This I'm using to reinforce a little bit of shadow underneath the eave of that roof. Coming up the roof line here with this dark value. Just making some marks to give the indication that there's layers of material here on this roof and that there's some dimension there. It's not just a thin edge. I want to give a little bit of the suggestion of the ornate elements of the poles here. They're round and turned with a lathe, and so I'm going to give the indication there of that feature. Once again, I'm coming in with a bit darker value here underneath this porch, cool tone. And I've done this a few times, but you can always go darker. It's much harder to go lighter. You can only rub off or lift, and it's very hard if you're just using watercolor paper to get back to the pure white of the paper. So that's why, as I said at the beginning, I start with large shapes, lighter values, and I work towards smaller shapes, darker values, and gradually build. So it doesn't bother me that I don't put a wash down the first time and leave it always. There's some times where it doesn't dry as dark as I'd like, and I just come back in and make it a darker valued wash. And now you can see how this wash here really makes this feel unshadowed. I'm going to take my 1/2 inch flat brush and take this darker value underneath the edge of the roof to make that just a bit darker. And you can see how I like to break shapes up. I didn't carry that wash all the way. I made just a slight break. It just makes it a lot more interesting rather than just having a bunch of straight, complete lines from point A to point B. This big open area on the side of the building here just feels a little too flat and uninteresting to me. So I'm just going to put a few brush marks down and spray that paint around a little bit and just create a little bit more interesting surface in that, within that shape. I've decided I want to warm this up just a little bit. So I'm taking a wash of yellow ochre and I'm just making some brush marks with it in some of these highlighted areas. Brings a bit of warmth, and I'm going to soften that up here with a spray bottle and just move that pigment around a little bit. And it just creates a little bit of a kind of a warm glow in some areas. Just giving a little bit of an indication of that. I want to try and take that to just a few other areas here on the other side. And just moving that color around in all the areas helps it feel a bit more unified. I don't want to just isolate it on one side of the building. So I've made a few of these brush marks here. And it's just reflected light. It warms it up a little bit. And I like to just soften it with a Kleenex or just hit it with a spray. And that's about it. So that's my painting, Homestead. As I've said throughout the video, it wasn't my intent to copy the photograph, but rather give my interpretation of the subject. Therefore, I chose to edit some elements out of the final painting that were in the reference photograph, and there's some elements that I decided to add that I thought would improve the composition. It's a fairly limited palette, but I still work with local color, mostly neutral, and a lot of use of warm and cool colors. There's also variation of edge throughout, soft edges, hard edges, and lost and found edges. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't had a chance, check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you ever have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. If you want to see more videos, you can go to my YouTube homepage, follow me on Facebook, and if you enjoy this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment. Thanks for watching.